Okay, so in this module, I want to take some time and discuss vApps, clones, and templates. We'll start off the discussion with vApps and then move into clones and then templates. And finally, we'll do some demonstration on creation and the settings for a couple of these. So let's start off with vApp. Um, so a vApp really facilitates the bundling of virtual machines under a common object. So say we need multiple servers to make an application available to end users. Okay. For example, we may need a database server, a web server, and an application server to work together to provide a service. Um, we could create a vApp container object. We could set a startup type, um, which server we want to come up first, and then we could bundle all those VM into a vApp. Okay, we could create settings and configure if we want them to start together, we don't want them to start together, and finally we could just export our vApp as a OVF template. We could also clone a vApp. Okay, so let's get into this a little more in detail. So for us to create vApps, we would basically need a vCenter server already in our infrastructure. Once we have that, um, we could create our inventory structure with folders, and one of the options there too is vApps. So let's take a look at some of the common settings that we could configure in a vApp. For settings, we have our application properties. So if we were to go in our vApp settings, we will see these different options we could configure. To start with, we would have our application properties. This would provide stuff like your product information that the vendor would have added. Basically, if you're creating a vApp from scratch, this area would be empty. You could configure these options in there. Okay. Secondly, we have our resource settings in our vApp. Here's where we'll modify the memory and CPU share, reservation, and limits for that vApp. Okay. Then coming down in our list, we have our unrecognized OVF section. So if our vApp was not created by the vSphere web client, it may include some information that is not recognized by our vCenter server. Okay, so those information would be listed as unrecognized, and we will see that there. Okay, so our IP allocation policy, we could configure a vApp to receive IP from a DHCP pool, or from our vSphere environment. Okay, so let's move on here. Startup and shutdown order. I would have discussed this. Here is where we could say, okay, our database server need to come up first, then our application server. So basically we have an option of creating groups and pointing our VM to those groups, and we could have one group start before another. All right, so that's where you would configure that under settings. So let me just get over to my vSphere client and we could just have a look at these settings. Okay, so I'll just go ahead here and bring across my vSphere web client. Before we get into the properties of our vApp and creation of our vApp and those settings, I would like to discuss a couple different ways of how we could actually add virtual machine to our virtual appliance. So our vApp basically is an appliance, a virtual appliance. So to start with, we could clone an existing virtual machine that is already in the vApp. That's one way of getting a virtual machine in there. Secondly, we could deploy a VM from template and then put that in our vApp. We could just drag a virtual machine into our vApp once we have that created. Um, Finally, we could just go into our vApp and create a virtual machine from scratch. That's another way of getting our VM in there. So just create a virtual machine, add a guest OS. That's just one way too. Okay. Um, it would be more common for you to just drag your virtual machine in there that you already have in your infrastructure, or if you're deploying from template and just point it into the vApp. Okay. So let me just go ahead here and create the vApp, and then we'll look at the properties. Okay, I have a couple here I was testing, so let's we have a different levels where we could create this in our inventory. Okay, so if we come to our cluster level, we could just do new vApp from there. If we have a folder infrastructure, we could just come there, new vApp. We have a couple options here. We could just go ahead and create a new vApp from scratch, or we could just create a new vApp from our library, from a template in there. Okay, so this is our content library, and this is new with vSphere 6. We'll discuss content library at the end of this module, so we'll leave the discussion for that um, towards the end of this module. So let's go ahead and create new vApp. Okay, so we have a couple options here too. We could create a new vApp or just clone an existing one. So we'll go ahead and create a new one. Okay. Um, let's just call this one finance. Sorry, let's just select our location and then we name our vApp. Just point it to ESXi1. vApp name, this is where we'll name it. Let's call this. Okay, so maybe our finance department need a couple virtual machine to provide an application, okay, to the users in there. So let's just assume we're creating that. Oh, I already have one finance in there. All right, we'll give this another. Call this IT. Okay, we'll just validate, and then we have a couple options here for resource. By default, we don't have any reservation or shares or limits configure. So this is operating as per normal. We'll just leave these default settings. We don't need to configure any of that. So we have a little summary here, and then we'll hit finish. Okay, so we should see this in our inventory in a little bit. Sometimes you need to just refresh the console here, so let's just do that. Okay, let's just take it in a couple seconds. Okay, so let's go over to our host and cluster view and take a look at our vApp there. So here it is, IT. Okay. Um, we have a couple settings we could look at for this vApp. So we'll go into the vApp properties or edit settings. So just right click on the vApp and then edit setting there. Here, edit setting. And then these are the settings we discussed in our slides. You have your CPU resources allocation, you could configure those here. Your memory reservation, you could configure those in here. Okay. Our unrecognized OVF section, this is if you were pulling a pulling our OVF from another infrastructure, we would see those under here. So IP allocation, we have some basic info on that here. And then notice at the bottom, we'd have some configurations here where we could set if we're doing DHCP or we're pulling our IP from the actual OVF environment. Okay, let's go up back here. If properties for this vApp would be listed if we had any in here. Okay, we'll have some more information when this was authored. If we actually were to deploy a vApp that was provided by some third-party vendor, chances are they would have included some information, or we could just manually place some info in there. This is the part I wanted to focus our attention on, the start order. And so we don't have any virtual machine in this vApp as yet, so we'll just move over to one where we have a couple of VMs and then take a look at the startup options. Okay, so as I mentioned, it's quite easy to move a VM into our vApp. We could just drag and drop into our vApp. Okay, so I have one here that was deployed as part of our vCenter Operations Manager. So this is a vApp that was provided by VMware. It currently has two virtual machines. That's what is deployed with, the Analytics VM and the User Interface VM. So if we were to go to the properties for this one, or the settings for this virtual machine, we'll see a couple more options here. Let me just open this a bit bigger. Okay, so our start order, this is what I wanted to discuss. We could have multiple groups here and just move our VM. Okay, so we want group 1 to start first. Once that the VMs that are listed there are up, then we want our user interface VM to come up. And here's where we'll set some of those options. Okay, so we will need like the amount of seconds here to elapse before, or the VMware tools to come up before we start the second group. This is where we'll configure those settings. All right. So let's right click back under our vApp here and look at the options that we have. What we could do is also create a child vApp and nest that into here, into this parent vApp. So if we were to go new vApp, we do have the option here of creating a new child or just doing a template from library. Okay, we could manually create our virtual machine and load our guest OS into this this vApp here. Okay, and we have our options just like a virtual machine. We could remove from inventory or basically delete it from this. All right, so this should close off our discussion on vApps. Next, I would like to discuss clones. So we'll talk about VM clones and then we'll move on with our discussion to templates. Okay. I'd like to now talk about cloning. So when we do a clone operation, we are basically creating an identical copy of an existing virtual machine. Okay. So what we could do is, before actually cloning a virtual machine, we could use the customization specification manager and create a group of settings, and basically we would attach these settings to the virtual machine once we're cloning it. So this basically helps the VM to have its own unique identity. So for example, each new machine that we clone could have a different IP address, host name, and license key to just make that VM unique. Okay, so we'll go through the process in a little bit to create a customization specification manager, and following that we'll do a cloning operation and attach that customized settings that we would have created. Okay, so we could clone a VM that is powered on. Just bear in mind that this process would take a bit longer than if you were to power that VM off and then clone it. Okay, so what happens when we clone a virtual machine? When we go ahead and we clone a virtual machine, it would leave the source VM untouched, whilst at the same time making an identical copy of it. Okay, so the copy would be a fully functional VM which we could power on and manage as normal. Okay, we would have the option too of cloning to a template. Basically, if we clone a VM to template, this would allow us to have a VM that would not powered on. So it will be as a like a master copy of our virtual machine from which we could deploy additional VMs. But we'll save the discussion for templates in a little bit. We'll cover that. All right, so let me pull up my vSphere client and then we'll demonstrate creation of our customization specification and then cloning operation. So here we have the vSphere web client. I'm at the home screen here. If we were to go under monitoring and then customization specification manager. Okay, so home, monitoring, customization specification manager. This little icon here, create a new specification. We'll just hit that. And let's go ahead and give this a name. Let's just call this server 2012. Okay. We could use a custom sysprep answer file here too. So we have a couple option, Windows and Linux. So we'll do Windows. Just give this a name. Basically, these are the same settings that you would enter when you're loading the guest OS for this VM. Okay, so let's give the VM a name now. Let's call this okay. So let's just call this WinStar 2012. We could use the virtual machine name too for the computer name, or we could just enter it once we're deploying the actual VM from clone. So let's just hit next. Here we could enter our unique product key. We'll just skip over that for now. Hit next. Let's just add a password to this. Okay. Let me just type this back in. Seems like we got something wrong here. Okay, so here we'll select our time zone and hit next. If we have any commands we would like to run at the first time that the user log on, we could add those commands here. So let's just hit next here. We have a couple options here for the assigning of our IP address to this interface, so we could manually do that, or we could use a DHCP on that interface. Here we have the option of joining a work group. We could enter the work group name here or our Windows domain. you would enter our domain and our credentials for that. So we could automatically join the VM the same time we are cloning it at the end of the cloning operation. All right. So here we'll create a new SSID or a new SID here. We'll generate a new one. Um, we'll hit next here. Then we have a little summary of our configurations for this specification, and just hit finish on that. All right. So here we have our customized specification. What we can do now is let's go to our we could either do it from the host and cluster view or from the VM and template. Let's select a VM we already have in the infrastructure here. So VM1, if I was to go under cloning, I have a couple options here. First, we could clone to virtual machine, which we would do. We could clone this to a template. So at the end of the clone operation, we'll have a template which we could use as a master image for creating additional VM. And then we could clone to a template and place that in our content library. Okay. So for now, let's just go ahead and clone this to virtual machine. So let's enter a name for this VM. Let's just call this application server. We're setting it in our inventory, our data center 1. On what resource we would like to run this clone on. So we could do it on the actual cluster and let it do a placement of that, or select the particular host. I'll go ahead and select ESXi1. Storage, we'll just leave it at the default cluster there, storage cluster that we have. Okay, so here we have the option of utilizing that customized specification that we created. So if I hit that and select next, okay, this is the specification that we just built. Okay, so I could just pull the settings from this and just hit next, and this would give us a little summary of what it's going to do, and then we could go ahead and clone this virtual machine. All right, so I'm going to just pause the recording for a little bit. Once this is finished, we'll continue from there. Okay, so now that our clone operation has completed, we should see our VM listed in our inventory. Here it is. So from here, we could power on this VM as per normal and work with it as we normally would in a VM that we created from scratch. Okay.